I know.
Point. Lauren, the lights.
Good evening. Welcome to the School of Architecture again. For those of you who aren't compelled to be here all the time, the rest of you, thank you for coming and joining us. And we're very fortunate tonight to be able to host a week-long series of events entitled New Ways of Inhabiting the City, generously sponsored by the Cervantes Institute, and also especially lucky to be able to have Stan Allen kick off that series tonight with his lecture entitled After Landscape Urbanism. The remainder of the week will be tomorrow, after Stan's sort of keynote lecture tonight, will be a roundtable discussion featuring Stan as well as Dana Cuff, some other distinguished visitors, Dana Cuff from UCLA, Sam Jacob from FAT in UK. Sam was with us last year also, so he's a regular now. We're going to put you on the list. As well as members of our faculty. On Wednesday at 1, Javier Vendrell will lecture entitled Before Landscape Urbanism. So we're going in reverse order. Somewhere Tuesday will be landscape urbanism very briefly. And finally, Friday at 1, Jose Antonio Acebillo will be lecturing, and his lecture is called Urban Turn, and that will be Friday at 1. And on Thursday, you don't have to do anything. The Cervantes has also sponsored a day off. So Thursday, we thank the Cervantes for the one day of freedom in the schedule. But it's a great privilege and opportunity to be able to have this series sponsored by the Cervantes, and at least publicly I'd like to thank the Cervantes Institute for their... So again, tonight we're very lucky to have someone who we wanted for a long time, Stan Allen, Dean of the School of Architecture at Princeton University, and principal of Stan Allen Architects since 1990. Stan is a longtime friend of ours collectively and the school. He was a visitor back here in the early 90s, I think lectured again here a few years ago, and is clearly a huge inspiration and formative intellectual force in many of us on the faculty, and certainly obviously in the city and among the students. Famously, Jeff Kipnis once said of Stan, after looking at his CV and his resume a number of years ago, he said, Stan Allen is either older than he seems or he's very confused. And really the comment was a nice way of saying the huge breadth and extent of his connections and accomplishments at a really early age. So I'd like to say that for someone so young, Stan has done a lot of things and become central to the field, to turn Jeff's comment into the pure positive that it is. Because in fact, for someone so young, Stan has seemingly been everywhere and done everything. And again, is really central to the kind of discussions, contemporary architectural discussions that we're having here and that are, in fact, internationally. I can't really think of anyone in the U.S. context who's been more responsible, who's worn more hats than Stan and done more to both discursively in writings and introducing international practices to the U.S., introducing U.S. practices to Europe, as a real emissary among a series of institutions and ways of operating, from designer to educator to author and critic. Stan has degrees from Brown University, which is clearly where he gets all his sharp wit and brilliance, the Cooper Union and Princeton, and also attended the Institute for Architecture and Urban Studies, Peter Eisenman's institute, while he was a student of Brown, somehow finagling that and getting credit at Brown while he was at the institute. Stan was the project editor of Assemblage magazine, where he turned a critical theory journal into a venue for advanced design projects, which no doubt presaged his role as dean at Princeton, where he's turned a critical theory school into a projective design school. you just have a job. His projects have been published in Points and Lines, Diagrams and Projects for the City, and his essays have been collected in Practice, Architecture, Technique, Representation, which is being reissued by Routledge and will be out again this month. Currently, his office is working on a 45,000 square meter contemporary music center in Taiwan, a gateway in Taichung, which won a PA award last year, a weekend house in Sagaponic, which is just being completed, a large landscape urban wetland project outside Seoul, Korea, and on, various scales and locations of award-winning projects around the globe. In 2002, Stan was recognized with the President's Citation for Exceptional Contributions to the Architecture Profession from the Cooper Union for the Advancement of Science and the Art. And again, I think everyone is aware of Stan's contribution of looking at field theory, not this kind of field theory, but another kind, in relation to urban and landscape strategies, and of course coining the phrase infrastructural urbanism, and his contributions to what later would become called landscape urbanism, even before it existed in name. And I think that, I don't know if Stan has this idea. I have a theory. Well, I have a lot of theories, but I have an axiom, which is whatever concepts you introduce into the field, you also have to take out before you leave. It's a kind of economy of means in don't leave ideas floating around that you no longer believe in. Make sure you take it out before you introduce another one. And so I appreciate Stan now taking out the ideas that he also helped bring in. This is an important development of always taking away. Don't just add to the world, take some stuff back out before you go. I think that Stan otherwise needs no introduction. Again, he's been back and forth to Chicago many times. In fact, we used to travel under the same tickets, he reminded me. That in the early 90s, when you could do this and they didn't check flights for shampoo and so on, we would fly as the same person to New York or to Chicago and just trade tickets, and no one checked. But I think it's also because apparently no one could tell us apart. In any case, please join me in welcoming Stan Allen.
Thank you, and thank you, Bob. Of course, it's great to be in Chicago. It's a great week to be in Chicago. And of course, Chicago is such a great architecture town, so it's really a pleasure to be here. And thanks to Bob, thanks to the Cervantes Institute for making this possible. And also, when Bob invites you to lecture, there's also a certain intellectual challenge. You can't simply sort of pull out your usual show and tell, but you really feel compelled to make an argument. And I like this notion of carry out what you carry in. And that is in fact the focus of this lecture tonight. And really, let's say, my own rather ambivalent relationship to landscape urbanism, which is in part having to do with kind of personal history, having collaborated from 1999 to 2003 with a landscape architect as a partner in field operations, and without claiming a lot of precedence, because the last thing I want to do is get into the kind of debates over who invented the term landscape urbanism and when that was done, but really to think about both the potentials and the limitations of what has come to be called landscape urbanism, and then to show a few projects that we're working on. In fact, I will show two projects in some detail, perhaps too much detail, and talk, because I think it's very important to demonstrate in a way how these ideas play out in practice. Because I think that's an important point to make, that when Jim and I were working on these ideas at the end of the 1990s, it's not as if we had a series of precepts and we used the projects to kind of illustrate those precepts. Really, the ideas arose out of the process of working and out of the specific practice challenges that we faced at that time. Okay, so there we go. Is that it for you? Let's hope not. All right. Well, can you hear me if I don't talk into the microphone? If I talk loudly? Yeah. Because I need to see the screen and point as well. Landscape urbanism, of course, is by definition a hybrid discipline. It was collaborative and cross-disciplinary from the start, and it seems to me that the strength of landscape urbanism at its origin is that landscape appeared as a discipline that was able to synthesize expertise from a number of different disciplines. That say from architecture, infrastructure, engineering, ecology, horticulture, and so on, that landscape was well positioned to sort of link between these multiple disciplines. And by now, with roughly a sort of 10 to 12 year history, landscape urbanism, of course, has a series of identifiable practitioners, a catalog of projects. There are academic programs in landscape urbanism, and of course a fully developed literature. Let's see now. There we go. Found the button. Just these I assume are familiar to everyone. I think the early thinkers around landscape urbanism were reacting to two things. On the one hand, you have the kind of paradigm of the 19th century pastoral urban park, Central Park here in New York, and clearly the park and the city occupy completely distinct realms. So this product of the 19th century thinking that really saw the landscape park as a kind of refuge from the density and dynamism of the city itself. Now, by the end of the 20th century, that had somehow deteriorated to the point where landscape could only really play a kind of decorative function. And the project of landscape architecture, such as it was in the 70s and the 80s, was really a kind of core stepchild of sort of land art projects, looking to the example of somebody like Mary Miss or Michael Heiser, but then translating that on the basis of a kind of narrative of identity and so on into a kind of decorative language that again remained very, very separate and simply could not touch the architecture that it was often framed by. Now, of course, the real problems that were facing the discipline of landscape were much larger and more complex than simply sort of a little bit of green space in front of an office building. And I think for ambitious landscape architects to either make the kind of refuge within the city or to simply decorate architecture were simply not interesting intellectual and practice projects. So the necessity then to derive a series of tools capable of dealing with this kind of complex, challenging, marginal distress sites, brownfield sites. The premise of landscape architecture, rather than seeing the city and nature as separate entities, really says that between these two images there is a lot that is shared. In both instances, you have a kind of embedded structure or an embedded infrastructure within the landscape that then, through process of time and the interaction with multiple variables, creates a kind of increasingly diversified landscape. Whether it's a natural landscape or an urban landscape, as shown in this case in the photograph, aerial photograph of Los Angeles by Andreas Gursky. I think there's another important point to be made is that landscape urbanism, as it developed, also, I believe, was particularly well suited for the kind of extended horizontal field of the American city. That if the city, if this kind of dense vertical city like New York is a product of the late 19th, early 20th century, cities in the late 20th century and the early 21st century are more and more extended horizontal fields made possible by infrastructural systems and, in a sense, sort of open and porous to the natural landscape. So the early ideas of landscape urbanism, I believe, were particularly well suited to this extended field of the American city. But there's another comparison that landscape, the propositions of landscape architecture were that these two images share a lot in common. So instead of looking at the natural systems simply for their sort of decorative value or as a kind of alternative to the density of the city, begin to look at natural systems as participating in the same kinds of complex channeling and routing and systematic character of something like the interstate highway. So the notion that this is a good lens to look at the new systems of the city as much as this is an interesting lens to look at natural systems and natural structures. So for those of you who are gardeners or readers of Deleuze, of course, here's the rhizome right here. So, all right. So just to run through a few very quick examples. This is one of the early diagrams that Jim and I produced for the Downsview competition. And what's interesting to me is that in a way the claim here is also in a way the claim of landscape urbanism. That notion of overview, prospect, and inclusion. That landscape urbanism was a big enough project in a sense that it could encompass engineering, architecture, infrastructure, and ecology, and so on. That by taking on these big, complicated sites, not only were you compelled to draw upon a much broader toolbox of ideas and techniques, you created, in a sense, a kind of larger canvas to work upon. Now, ironically, and again, this sounds contradictory, but I think that landscape was particularly well positioned to do that. I think in part, I think this is paradoxical but true, because landscape was a kind of minor discipline that had been kind of marginalized at that particular time, and in a way, because their disciplinary protocols were looser, they had less of a kind of historical baggage, landscape was well positioned to kind of claim this very large territory. So landscape urbanism is simultaneously a move to the center to claim this big territory at the same time as it takes advantage of its sort of minor status on the edges of the let's say, the kind of historically sanctioned disciplines like engineering and architecture. Or this is another example, again, one of the early diagrams from the Fresh Kills competition. If you contrast this to that image of Central Park, where the city and nature are inhabiting different realms, they're adjacent but separate. Part of our ambition with Fresh Kills was that the site of the competition, which was here, was really seen to be continuous with a much larger system of a kind of green infrastructure on Staten Island. So again, there was an ambition, there is an ambition in landscape urbanism to really follow one of the basic precepts of ecology, which is that ecological systems don't respect boundaries. Ecological systems are always drawing from a very wide range of adjacent systems and always operating in a larger context. And then finally, a very important point that landscape urbanism was time-based and process-oriented. That is to say, it made explicit to its working methodologies the fact that if you work in the urban context, you're always dealing with a long-term horizon of implementation and multiple agents interacting over time. So again, many of the models from ecology that look at the behavior of systems and questions of emergence and adaptation and the notion of sort of seeding a site with potential and then steering it through some sort of management operation become very useful when you start talking about working on these big, complicated, challenging sites where, of necessity, many, many people have an interest in the project and are going to have a say over time in the project. So the idea that you need to control that process over time, I think, again, has to be thought of as one of the major contributions of landscape urbanism. So, again, I present this in a way, in a slightly ambivalent sense, that I believe that in some sense, I think you could say that if you look at the past 15 years, along with the emergence of the protocols for digital design, I think the emergence of landscape urbanism has to be one of the major developments in the field. At the same time, looking at it from this sort of 10 or 12-year perspective and sort of stock taking on both the potentials and the limitations of landscape urbanism, I think we can start seeing also certain questions, certain limitations that have to be addressed. Now, the primary working variables in landscape urbanism are surface and pattern, program and event, and process and change. I've talked a little bit about that, but again, just to give a little bit more detail here. Landscape urbanism gives us a different way of looking at surface. It gives us a way of looking at surface not exclusively from a formal point of view, but really seeing how, again, the embedded intelligence of a surface has implications for the development of that site over time. In a way, it simply has to do with kind of thinking like a farmer and the kind of intelligence that the farmer exercises in understanding, let's say, that these zones are going to be wetter than these zones, and that in the kind of interaction between the soil chemistry, the slopes, the gradients, the rainfall over time, the embedded intelligence of this structure is going to produce difference over time. And that indeed was part of the proposition of the Downsview project that Jim and I developed. But it's not only surface, it's also pattern. And the way in which, for example, in this early study for the Botanical Garden at Puerto Rico, by working with different kinds of patterns, we could propose different potential identities for the park, ranging from the notion of a botanical forest through to a botanical city, each one having implications for different programs, different densities, and different ways of organizing the site. The question of program, the understanding on the one hand that it is basically on this extended horizontal field that program plays itself out, and the incredible sort of appeal of a kind of indeterminate programming where you create a kind of service infrastructure, you provision the field, and then you can accommodate many, many different kinds of programs. Again, landscape seems to be a kind of privileged discipline for thinking about a kind of open, indeterminate programming. The notion that on an open green field, you can support sports events, you can support big concerts, you can support very informal events, you can support formal events. This notion has proven to be incredibly appealing to architects as they try and work in a more open-ended way with programming. This was something these are the initial studies for the CMC, Contemporary Music Center, that we're working on in Taiwan. This project has undergone a lot of transformation, and if I were to lecture again in a year, you'll see a much more updated version. But here we really were trying to use the shaped surface as a way to get away from the singularity of the typical outdoor music amphitheater to create what we were referring to as a kind of events landscape that would not only be active over the course of the entire day or the course of the entire season, but really support a multiplicity of events through a kind of shaped landscape that oriented and directed different events, but then also within the thickness of that surface supported certain infrastructural programs. And finally, this notion of process and change, that again, landscape architecture has proven to be a really valuable discipline to think about process and change. When a landscape is finished, it's never complete. And even in a conventional landscape like Central Park, there's a very high degree of maintenance required to maintain a kind of steady state. Landscape architects famously, architects design to the construction budget, landscape architects design to the maintenance budget. So it would be interesting to think, as an architect, how would that change your thinking? In other words, taking responsibility for the life of the project over time once the construction is finished. Now, of course, that includes things like changes of the seasons, but it also includes thinking about the much larger cycles of change and evolution that necessarily affect a landscape. So today, when landscape architects work, they don't necessarily think of simply a sort of qualitative change of the landscape that they plant growing into maturity and then staying at a kind of steady state, but they've really embraced a kind of qualitative change based on ecological notions of succession, where you can imagine on a single project multiple spatial states over time. I think, again, one of the best examples of that was in the Downsview project that Jim and I did in 99-2000, where through creating a kind of shaped landscape on the site, these series of what we call habitat nests over the range of the site, and depending on where those nests were on the site and the different conditions, we would create a multiplicity of different spatial experiences over time as the landscape acquired difference based on the initial states, so that, for example, the upland nests would tend towards a tall grass prairie, whereas the wetter lowland nests would acquire a kind of density and a kind of intimacy based on the tightness. So, again, I think it should be clear from now, I think there are tremendously important discoveries and very powerful tools that have come out of working in landscape urbanism, but I think there are some pitfalls as well. And before I move on to the projects, I just want to talk a little bit about what I'm calling the 4 crutches of landscape urbanism. I need 3 more crutches, if you remember the famous article by Philip Johnson from 1954, The 7 Crutches of Modern Architecture. I'm working on 3 more, but the problem with the surface and the strong attention to the horizontal dimension in landscape architecture is, in my mind, on the one hand, it promises this notion of total connectivity, which of course we're all enamored of, that we've been trained by our kind of engagement with modern media to think that being connected is a good thing. But I think especially if one pays very close attention to architectural potentials, I think we have to be careful that as designers, as architects, we need to deploy separation as well as deploying connectivity. So the kind of celebration of surface continuity and connectivity that seems to be so tied to landscape and landscape urbanism is something that I think not only do you very quickly come to a limitation of those programs that can be accommodated through a kind of single surface continuity project, but in fact I think even from, let's say, a kind of social and political point of view, the notion that you need to be as attentive to the moments where you need breaks and separation and discontinuity as well. The second notion is, again, to be cautious about the appeal to programmatic indeterminacy. The idea that, yes, in a kind of open green field, anything can happen, and therefore it's very attractive, that this can become an alibi, that for lack of programmatic specificity, for lack of commitment, that you simply say, well, I don't have to think about program, I don't have to design program, because it's all going to kind of bubble up indeterminately, and I've allowed for the kind of openness of an indeterminate program. The problem is in those sites where anything can happen, very often nothing happens. So again, a plea for a kind of specificity and commitment, and a wider toolbox, again, that would put programmatic specificity, in a sense, back on the table, co-equal perhaps to the strategic use of programmatic indeterminacy. And finally, this critique of the notion of emergence and self-organization. Any ecologist will tell you that you don't get emergence without highly specific initial variables and a degree of difference embedded in that system in the first place. Again, there's a notion, especially you hear this among students, that somehow you can just evoke a kind of bottom-up self-organization and that formal specificity will take care of itself. Well, self-organization doesn't happen without highly specific initial variables. In fact, without a highly specific design proposition at the beginning of the project. So again, that's one of the other kind of crutches. And then finally, just to talk a little bit about these questions of the artificial and the natural, sort of where one locates oneself in relationship to that discourse. It's clearly implicated in questions of landscape urbanism. These are two photographs from Olmsted's work, as you can read there. This is a tree moving machine from the construction of Prospect Park. And on the left is a bit of the infrastructure required to create the naturalistic pastoral landscape of Central Park. So we in a way, we know that in the case of urban landscapes like Central Park, that nature is constructed. And this, in a sense, became a kind of critical project in the 1980s, and it coalesced around the competition for Parc de la Villette. And in both the winning Schumi project and the canonical OMA project, culture and architecture was a lens through which nature was viewed. They were both, in a sense, the kind of outcome of this critical project that said that all nature is constructed, therefore we should make the construction of nature absolutely explicit, force the greenery into this very geometric organization, and so on. Coincidentally, both projects designed by architects, not landscape architects. I think on the one hand, I think that critical project has kind of run its course. It's not necessarily news to us anymore that all nature is constructed. I think we're starting to view nature through a slightly different lens. I think if we look at nature through the lens of things like genetic engineering, biomimesis, if we look at nature through the thinking of landscapes, for example, as biological machines, we start to blur that strict boundary between nature and culture that in a sense was the critical engine of projects for like La Villette. And even at a very kind of immediate level, we start seeing projects at the level of architecture that are mixing nature and architecture into new kind of interesting hybrid and promiscuous mixtures, which seem to me to be more promising in the present than the kind of critical project of laying bare the device of constructed nature. And then finally, the last query I would sort of put on the table with regard to landscape urbanism, if this is the sort of urban landscape that we're having to deal with in the 21st century, it's not entirely clear to me that the working tools of landscape urbanism are so adequate to deal with these kinds of densities, with the verticality, with the kind of urban intensity of these sites. So all of that, again, is a kind of series of questions put on the table that I would say very much inform our day-to-day practice in the office. So I'd like to, in a sense, elaborate that through two specific examples. The first is the Taichung Gateway Park. And Taichung does not quite look like this. It does look like this. It is a pretty intense urban environment. It's a relatively small city. It's about an hour south of Taipei by the high-speed train. It's the second city in terms of population to Taipei on the island. And this is an aerial photograph that locates our project. The historic center of the city is down here. You can see more or less that the city has grown. There are a series of ring roads and radial avenues. And this site was the original municipal airport for Taichung. The city, as you can see in the aerial photograph, has grown up to encompass the airport. And in 2000, a new airport was constructed out here. I think 2002 this was opened. And this site was cleared, leaving this incredible void within the urban fabric of Taichung. The site is 240 hectares, that's about 600 acres. It is about as close as you can get today to a tabula rasa. It's dead flat, there are no structures on site, and of course it's been cut off from the city for 40 years. So it's an incredible opportunity, a kind of clean slate to do something, but of course it has absolutely no identity in the minds of the people of Taichung. Internally, it's completely undifferentiated, and of course it's completely cut off from the existing city. So in thinking about how we could link this site back to the city, grow the site over time, of course we looked at natural systems such as river systems. We looked at the tradition of linear cities within the discipline. In part, this had to do with the notion that we had to connect. This is the road to the new airport. The traffic planners mandated that road go through our site so as to connect back to the historical center here and a new civic center here. Here you can see the system of ring roads and radial avenues. But we wanted to integrate this mandate with a sense of the relationship of the site to the natural systems, including a kind of accidental green belt created by the river and the presence of a ring road there. The other thing was to be very, very pragmatic about the process of implementation in this regard, and to understand that the city can control open space and the city can control roadway. The city doesn't really have full control over the urban fabric that would grow up on this site over time. So the initial move was to take that through road, create a series of very broad sweeping curves that would sort of sweep out green spaces and a kind of figural form for the park, and then at the same time kind of erase the old figure of the site. We wanted this figure that had been a void to really disappear, and we wanted the figure of the park to reappear instead. So we wanted that old boundary to disappear and simply kind of let the city grow into the park. The argument here is not only are we pragmatic about what the city has control over, roadways and open space, there's an intrinsic flexibility to a structure that can accommodate a full different range of programs, whether it goes very much in the ecological direction or very much in the commercial direction, without fundamentally changing the structure of the park. The mayor hated the road. He said, well, I promised the people of Taichung a park, I didn't promise them a road, and you gave me a road. So like good professionals, we hummed and hawed and said, we tried to convince him that it was our green road, and the road really was a park, and he didn't buy that argument. And it was actually good, because we went back and we rethought, and we had to come up on the one hand with another set of logics for the project and a different geometry. So the notion that we're sort of threading the needle here between the built and the green, and then deriving the geometry of the park from the strategies of collecting and channeling the runoff so that we can reactivate the park. There are a series of canals on site already, and in fact that geometry becomes the controlling geometry for the park itself, leaving us with this as the final site plan, which was presented about 9 months ago and is being written into the planning codes for the city. This is what it looks like in 3D. And I think it's important to say here, again, thinking about this notion of after landscape urbanism or beyond landscape urbanism, certainly at one level here we are using landscape urbanist techniques, but we're also using other techniques, so that you can see here the way in which we've tried to blur the boundary of the previous site, letting the city grow up to and define this figure. And I will say, quite honestly and polemically, that our strategies in these areas are somewhat new urbanist. We're basically working with gridded blocks and design guidelines. But we don't make a project of new urbanism. We use it where it works within the kind of larger polemic of the project. Here at the northern end of the site, we're trying to leverage the architectural presence and create a kind of gateway condition with large buildings that span the park with occupiable roofs that create a kind of architectural presence, and use the formal definition of the architecture to kind of steer the future development of the site. So again, there our approach is really working with large-scale architectural and infrastructural pieces. Again, all of these parks have multiple layers that talk about the range of programs and activities that a park like this can support. Because in the 21st century, when you make a park, you're not simply making a kind of green refuge. You're really making a kind of active programmatic site. This is a view from the southern end, looking up at the boulevard that now goes through from the city to the park and then back to the city, and the kind of gateway condition of those large buildings. The experiments for the disposition of that roadway. And then this is the drawing that talks a little bit about our thinking for those neighborhoods that are kind of mapped out by the figure of the park. That we have essentially 4 distinct neighborhoods, and the process there was one of understanding that if we could define the park itself with a fairly high degree of precision, locating the roadway, designing the park, developing the connections here, we could only steer development fairly loosely. Hence the kind of heat map of density that would be produced over time, and the use of conventional methodologies such as typologies. We spent a lot of time studying existing urban structures in Taichung and using a kind of sampling of existing blocks and types to create what is, in essence, a kind of zoning map for the development beyond the limits of the figure of the park. So that this is, in a sense, the desire, but this will be produced only by the participation of many different hands over a long period of time. So just to zoom in a little bit on those buildings at the northern end of the site, this is the ring road and the expressway. So these sort of 3 towers create a kind of parallax condition as you move around the site, these 3 markers that would always be changing in relationship to the moving car. And the idea that we're creating now a vertical relationship between the city and the park, not simply a horizontal relationship. This is a cut through at the elevated level. This is a convention center piece here, connecting into a small domed stadium, the base of the hotel here. This is a kind of intermodal transit center here, and office building and hotel on that end. So here you see a little bit the way those programs are distributed. And then this is the kind of stacking of programs with a large infrastructural base here. Again, some of the thinking that we explored in the CMC project. The park sliding under this convention center bridge, and then the kind of vertical markers of those towers beyond. So here you see the section through from the east-west and the convention center piece itself that needed to read as a landscape both from above and from below. Here's a section north-south through that landscape piece. And again, the view essentially from the elevated road where you would have the experience of these three towers changing in perspective as you move across the landscape. And of course, the notion that this site needs kind of iconic presence, not only from the street, but from the air, and of course at nighttime as well. And again, I talked about the lesson from landscape urbanism about time and process and change, and that was certainly very much in our minds here. Now, of course, generally the first stage is demolition. That's already done for us. We're given this sort of empty tabula rasa. The first step is the mapping out of this kind of eco-reserve. The next step is an infrastructural one, roads and the restoration of that water infrastructure. And then you get the pioneers. The public investment in something like the transit center, or the private investment in, let's say, the kind of high-priced real estate at the edge of the park. Then again, investments that can be made by either the city or, in this particular case, cultural institutions. There's a university here and a proposal to relocate the China Medical College here. Then the early adopters who will follow the lead, begin building out the site, and finally in something like a 15-year horizon, although these things happen faster in Asia, a kind of full build-out of the site. So, all right. As I said, that was a master planning project, very much engaged with a kind of strategic thinking about process, using a multiplicity of different tools, dealing on the one hand with the specificity of design of the park itself, but then also using some more conventional tools like design guidelines. This more recent project that we're doing in Taipei was a kind of opportunity to really work more directly with a kind of infrastructural element. Now, so there's a kind of polemical statement here about the potential of infrastructural urbanism in the city, but it's important to say that here, that wasn't something we brought to the site. The site was, the problems of infrastructure were there on the site to begin with, and in order to work successfully, we really wanted to take the existing infrastructures on the site and make them into an asset rather than a liability. This is the site. It's located in Taipei on the river. The sort of downtown of Taipei is about a kilometer that way. The 101 Tower is there. And this particular, you can see the green area between these two roads. This is being developed as a kind of corridor. There's a new Taipei Central Station, a series of new office towers. And we were asked to look at this waterfront site that would be at the kind of terminus of this axis. That included this portion. You can see the bridge coming in here, and also this piece here, site of an existing parking garage that created an opportunity to build inboard on the site and connect. This was the problem. Taipei is prone to flooding in typhoon season, and they have adopted a very rigid engineering mentality that says in order to protect themselves from the water, you build an 8.6 meter high concrete wall. It's It's very effective in keeping the water out. It's also very effective in keeping people from the city out of the waterfront. This was really the thing that we had to deal with. These are just a couple of images of the site. So this is our point. We didn't bring the infrastructure thematic to the site. That infrastructure thematic was really given. This is all of the off-ramps of that bridge. This is the wall here. And you can also see that there's a relatively small distance between the wall and the waterfront here. Or from the city side here, again, a lot of infrastructure. The infrastructure is big impact on this side. And then again, here is that blank 8.6 meter high wall. So again, just a little bit of context. Here's the river. Here is our site here. Taipei actually, because of the topography, there is quite a bit of green space within the limits of the site, but except for those mountain sides, there's very little green space within here. So one of the chief opportunities would be, in fact, to colonize the waterfronts, but then you run up against the problem of that wall. This is just the diagram I was telling you, this new axis of development meeting the waterfront exactly at this point on the site. And a few more images of that wall, which, again, I don't have to convince you that it's going to limit access. It blocks the views. But it also has created a kind of monoculture in the ecology beyond the site. A monoculture both in the sense that the natural ecology is very limited and the programmatic ecology is very limited. So we always look in our office for solutions rather than solving a laundry list of problems and creating a many-faceted solution. We always look for one or two moves that will solve many problems simultaneously. So the problem of the flood wall, the circulation, the program, the poor ecologies, and so on, could all be solved by this double strategy of what we call the serpentine levee wall and the landform topography. This one thing did jump around in the PowerPoint. Basically, the entire logic of the project is in this diagram. The current wall at 8.6 meters high separates the city and the waterfront, and it really limits what you can do in this distance. The proposition is that instead of having a vertical wall, if we could shape the topography of the site, always maintaining the 8.6 meter height, we guarantee the same level of flood protection. And not only do we create the possibility of a much smoother access to the park, getting away from the kind of barrier condition of that wall, we also create increased programmatic opportunities because we can shape this mound in many different ways in order to increase the programmatic opportunities. So not only do we shape it in section, we shape it in plan, we pull it into the site and out, creating a kind of complex edge. Again, just some kind of images of the kind of serpentine model, and a view of the proposal that was presented. This is still in its fairly preliminary stages, but this was the proposal that was presented in August to the mayor in Taipei. So you can see the wall loops in fact, and engages the base of this new tower, comes out here to create this big amphitheater with a smooth access, in and out again, the smooth access incorporates a parking garage here, and then back in and ties up to this kind of marina piece at the end. So this one move of shaping, getting rid of the wall, shaping the topography, allows us a whole series of solutions. And by the way, as the project is then developed over time, I mean, this is the current stage of the project, but if it turns out with more detailed programmatic and site analysis that instead of pushing out here and in here, we ought to push out here and in here, that's completely consistent with the logic of the project. So in other words, we're not wedded to a particular formal configuration, we're wedded to a kind of strategy that in turn permits a whole different series of formal solutions. That's more or less what that says, so you don't have to read that. So an image of the potentials of the park there, and again, just to kind of to take you through the logic of cutting that ribbon, shaping the waterfront. Again, from an ecological perspective, a longer shoreline is much better. It creates different ecological, it creates different microecologies across its length. We slightly diminished the overall area from here to here as we carve in and out. And then with the wall itself, we create these two zones of continuous public access, and then by manipulating the wall, we can create more conventional kind of gateway conditions. And of course, with this shaped landscape, we create opportunities for elevated views, for different kinds of both configurations and different kinds of programs. So then here's the view then from the northern edge of the site, again getting that kind of overview of the potential effects of putting the wall into this form, creating the smooth access. And again, I will say, quite honestly, we took some liberties with the rendering, but the other point here is that fundamentally, outside of the wall, this is mostly hard surface, because we know this will be subject to flooding outside the wall, whereas we can then propose a landscape on this side of the wall that is finer and more delicate, that could never stand up to the rigors of the flooding. So again, these are simply the layers of that plan, the landscaped areas, the pathways, the hard boardwalk, outboard of the wall, and a series of built interventions. This is really simply to kind of signal that, in fact, a lot of the plan configurations here were actually devised from a script that was written by one of the kids in the office, and you can see all of the underlying geometry is based on these nested hexagons, which again, this is another tool which we can use to adjust the project over time in response to changing programmatic demands without losing some of the kind of fundamental geometry of the plan. Let's say some of the more conventional drawings, the base of the tower contains a large parking garage, and this piece here contains a large parking garage, so we get our 5-minute walking circles that ensure access across the site, the potential programs that could develop over that site over time, the landscape conditions, and then zooming in a little bit to a kind of marina area at the top where you see the section, the smooth slope up, the embedding of the parking garage, and then the hard surfaces outboard of the wall, the big amphitheater located at the end of that axis, occupying the kind of understory of all of these off-ramps, really kind of celebrating the infrastructure and creating the possibility for large-scale gatherings that would be kind of inserted into this infrastructure landscape. And then finally, at the south end of the site, taking advantage of that one inboard urban site to build a kind of iconic building in a sense where this linear infrastructure of the waterfront is wrapped up into a spiral to create an iconic piece of architecture. A piece of architecture which at its base accommodates parking and buses and infrastructure, and the top of this is level more or less with the 8.6 meter serpentine crest, but then above that level creates both public spaces, public green spaces that are connected back to the park, so it's as if we bring a piece of the park into the city here, and then moving up through a series of programs devoted to shopping, and in order to tie back to the program of the waterfront, an aviary and aquarium that will bring some of those kind of nature functions into the kind of iconic form of the building itself that you see here section. Here's the height of that wall, the infrastructural base, the big gap here, sort of under the skirt that extends the park at the elevated level, and then the tower itself progressing up through there. And then this is a planning idea for extending that deeper into the section of the city. So here you see from the northern end of the site, the most here, a kind of reconstructed wetland, in a sense the most naturalistic part of the waterfront park. If the active functions are concentrated at the north end of the park, the more naturalistic functions concentrated here at the south, but then connecting back to the city, the iconic form of the tower, and the kind of leapfrogging of some of those natural functions into the tower itself. All right, I think those are the two primary projects that are working with these problems of landscape urbanism, and infrastructure, giving you a little bit of a sense of how those questions and variables are playing themselves out in our office at this time. I want to end by showing a few architectural projects, because simply from the point of view of the work in our office, our time is roughly spent between urbanism, landscape, and architectural projects. So in part, my, let's say, ambivalence and critique and questioning of the precepts of landscape urbanism, in part simply comes from my disciplinary identity as an architect, that this is one among many potential tools available to us in the office. So I'm going to show very quickly a competition project which we did not win. I don't like to show projects where we didn't win. I also don't like to, we don't generally enter open competitions, but this building, Asplin's Stockholm Public Library, is a building which to me is so interesting and iconic that, and the relationship of the building to the park, it really seemed like an opportunity that was too good to pass up. It was really a competition that we did really for the sake of the competition, not necessarily with any expectation of winning in this big sort of open forum. Although I think our project is better than the one that won, but that always sort of goes without saying. The problem here was having this very iconic building, and that doesn't really sit in a park-like setting, but nonetheless has this very interesting connection to the park. Well, the problem was that the brief required us to add on to this building 3 times its existing square footage. And you see below a few of our very preliminary solutions. And I think, again, and perhaps it was polemical on our part at this point, but the finalists in this project were roughly mixed between sort of landscape solutions and object solutions. And I think we set out, in a sense, very consciously to create a dialogue with the existing building. And I thought the only way to effectively create a dialogue with the existing building was to make another object. That for me, that in a sense here, a kind of landscape solution would have been a kind of cop-out. It would have, in a sense, for me, projected a kind of lack of confidence in architecture's capacity to create another object that could establish a strong dialogue with the existing building. So, given this problem of the immense amount of space that had to be added, our first move was, in a sense, to kind of duplicate the volume of the building, but that by itself didn't give us enough square footage. So the idea that we would start by duplicating the volume of that building, but then we would see that new volume, instead of a kind of self-sufficient autonomous object, as the old Aspen building is, to see it as a kind of node within a larger network, the place where these new routes would cross and intersect, so that the other programs, in passing through, this cube, which duplicated the volume of the existing building, are sort of hollowing it out and eroding it from within, in a sense, kind of eroding its kind of autonomy and objecthood, both by creating a complex topological condition and by connecting to other programs. So basically, the scheme is that we duplicate that volume, and by creating this series of 3 bridges that tie into, then those bridges are organized thematically and programmatically. That the history bridge links back to the existing building. These were also, by the way, categories in the collection that they wanted us to refer to. The nature bridge goes back to the park. The institutional bridge is another, I don't want to spend too much time on it. These 3 buildings, it was recommended that they be preserved, even though they are fairly nondescript. But these 2 were built in the 30s. This one was built in the 50s. We proposed to keep those 2 and demolish this one. So that institutional piece is tying back to those existing pieces, and the city piece, of course, is opening to the city itself. So this is what it looks like on site: the history bridge, the nature bridge, linking back to a kind of artificial extension of the park itself, this bridge connecting to the existing pieces, and this one to the city itself. So that becomes the grand entry, and this is the kind of lobby condition, and then you see those 2 existing buildings. Here is the building in context, and our idea here was to create something that was kind of icy and lacy and ephemeral, with a very clear, clean geometry, but then a much more uncertain sense about where its edges and boundaries were, as a way of creating a kind of dialogue with the aspirant building. So just to move, the bridges are kind of spiraling up through this organization, connecting back, so you see the way that then the voids that they create are always interlocked within the structure of the cube, and then you see the relationship that the primary entry establishes with this street here. So, and then, again, entering into a little bit these questions of surface and pattern, and using that as a potential for a kind of narrative, connecting back on the one hand to Aspland through the gates of the Woodland Cemetery, on the other hand to the sort of cultural context of Stockholm through this beautiful device which one of the kids in the office found. This is Linnaeus's flower clock. So, that patterning is applied outside, and then because of the topographic logic of the bridges, folded back inside to create a kind of continuous surface of patterning throughout the volume of the public spaces of the building itself. All right. So in part, again, this sort of question that landscape urbanism is not really capable of dealing with objects, but on the other hand, there is something, I think, in the sort of atmospheric character of these surfaces, perhaps in the way that we're linking this building, taking a slightly infrastructural approach to the site, that is something I think we learned from the experience with landscape, although there are no explicit landscape references here. All right. Well, the last things I want to show, again, I think really 2 things. I mean, first of all, it's important, I think, to note that we work on multiple scales, and I think it's important for an architect to do that, because working at multiple scales also implies that you work at different speeds, that these large public projects take months for approval and years for implementation, and I think it's very important to see other projects through to completion, which in our context happen to be some smaller scale projects. We do have some larger scale things under construction, but not sort of ready to show the finished photographs. And those things range from this sort of tiny scale of house addition out on Long Island that was completed last year, but in particular, this image is really serving as much as anything else to signal a kind of interest in our work at that time with this iconic form of the kind of light scoop or kind of activated roof. This is the Sagaponic project, which was finished last year. For those of you who don't know, this was a project where 35 architects were commissioned to do speculative single-family houses on pretty much suburban scale lots in Long Island. There was a funny line in the original brief that said that the client, the developer essentially, wanted more or less traditional roof lines. That sounded to us like a code word for no pitched roofs. No flat roofs. And of course, we didn't really want to go directly to the kind of vernacular of the pitched roof. So, by the use of these two very tall skylights, we were able to give the house a kind of iconic form. Really pay attention to the house as a kind of vertical entity. I mean, again, the tension here with landscape. If landscape is all about the horizontal plane, when you work at this smaller scale, you're thinking about the figure of the house on the landscape, the kind of iconic form of the house. Also, there was a simple, very pragmatic issue here, which was to say that the lots were very small, the views weren't terribly good, so this idea of kind of internalizing the house and creating expansiveness in the vertical direction. So you can see that the house is, in a sense, very kind of austere and barn-like on the exterior, not opening up to the context. The reference to a kind of traditional form of chimney, traditional form of pitched roof, but of course it's not carried through in the other geometry. So you see here the way in which, by activating the vertical axis here in the primary living spaces, this is a full 3 stories tall, a kind of balcony access here, that we wanted to create a sense of expansiveness internally to the house, not a sense of expansiveness in the terms of sort of extending the views out beyond the house, and that extends to individual rooms, a lot of which keep again most of their light from above, from these big skylights, and very limited openings to the exterior, creating this kind of expansive sense. And then here on the back, where this kind of bridge piece is, we do open that up more, where you're kind of viewing the private space of the garden beyond. This theme of this kind of light scoop is then kind of continued in a project for a house in the Philippines that is due to start construction relatively soon. And you can see here we were working with a very steep slope site. The water is down here. So there are really sort of 2 moves in this project. On the one hand, to create a kind of artificial topography, which becomes the primary living zone of the house here at this lower level, and then to kind of shape in a very kind of iconic way. And in this case, actually, the orientation of these has to do with literally catching the wind and increasing the natural ventilation. The house is to be constructed in reinforced concrete, and then this kind of open skin of wood, which is laid over it, almost like a kind of basket weave, which alludes to some of the traditional traditional ways of building in the Philippines. So you see here, there are virtually no partitions on this lower level, and the doors slide open, and then the bedrooms upstairs with these large skylights, so that from the street level, in a sense, all that you see is this kind of roof landscape with these roof scoops coming up to reach it. Well, the image that was floating on the screen for the introduction is the other project that's recently finished construction, this small chapel in the Philippines that we just finished, which you see here under construction. It's an interesting piece of background to this structure, this commission. The Chosen Children's Village is a charitable organization that takes care of orphans and has a very high percentage of disabled children. And they came to us through someone in my office with this site and a very limited budget, basically saying they couldn't pay us for our services, but they would build anything that we drew, which is hard to resist as an architect. The primary campus is here, and our project also forms a kind of gateway to the site. So as you come from the village, the bell tower that we hope will eventually be built and the chapel create a kind of gateway condition to their campus beyond it, which you can see is relatively conventional with sort of stucco and green roofs. So we wanted to do something different, and there were a number of constraints, really. I mean, on the one hand, the budget was very, very limited. On the other hand, the building is in a very high seismic zone, so we had to deal with the structural implications of that. The Philippines, like Taiwan, is subject to typhoons and really a very extreme climate condition. Because of the handicapped children, the structure had to be very open and very, very accessible, very continuous. This is the final plan, and you can see that the logic of the plan is a kind of single line, which is kind of kinked on its sides, which creates a kind of intrinsic stability. As everyone knows, a wall which is bent is intrinsically stable, and this also creates a kind of modulation of the space of the church, and it opens up here, so it squeezes down at the entry and opens up here at the altar. We certainly didn't have this in mind, but it has been suggested that it recalls a pair of embracing arms. But also the kind of economy of means in the plan language, that line is simply loops back on itself here to form the bell tower, the vestry, and direct the entry here, and loops back on itself here to form the baptistry, and then simply these big pivoting doors here, such that when it's open, the ground plane flows very smoothly in. A very beautiful acacia tree here that was preserved. So this is the view of the interior. We're still looking for funds to build the chairs that we've designed. But there's something about this, the thing which is interesting about this, and I think can be connected back to the thinking about landscape, is this is a building which is really more of a pavilion than a building. It's got no HVAC system, there's no glass in the windows. When it rains, the rain rains right into this building, the wind blows right through it. So it really is that sense of a piece of architecture in a very kind of elemental sense that's very, very directly connected to the environment, something that frankly is very rare today and very difficult to do. It made this a very really kind of special opportunity for us. So you can see here, for example, that this structure just opens up to create the natural ventilation at this point, and as I said, the rain just comes right through. The shaped roof was very much in response to shedding water during the torrential downpour. I mentioned the problem of the seismic design. We had to create lateral stability, but we wanted to maintain the lightness of this pier-like structure and the kind of moving panels. You can see that those panels overlap to form two zones of continuity that in effect form horizontal beams. So working within the depth of the 40-meter pier, that there is horizontal continuity in this zone and horizontal continuity in this zone that provides effective lateral stabilization, but without giving a sense of kind of massiveness to the overall design. And you see here a little bit the way that comes down to the ground. The other interesting thing about this building It was built very, very cheaply using essentially available technologies there, which is reinforced concrete construction, and then everything is covered with a layer of plaster. You can see here the kind of solutions that were worked out with the engineer, with the exposed construction, and then working within the thickness of that pier and the enclosure on the inside and the outside, and then the slots that allow the light in. And those slots are painted, and they give a kind of very subtle coloration to the sidewall there. They sent us construction photographs when the reinforced concrete was being done, and we took one look at it and said, this is going to be a total disaster. We gave them something way too complicated. It's really crude. They don't understand what we're trying to do. And magically, in the last 6 weeks of the project, the army of plasterers arrived, and they made everything perfect. So again, it's a question of working with the available technologies in a situation like that. Here you see the way in which we handled the altar and the cross as a kind of void. In fact, it is one of the primary vertical supports for the back wall. You see it here. You see the exposed beams, the front facade with the doors, which completely open to create that continuity with the landscape, the detail of those doors themselves. We are working with an artist named Stephen Westfall, who will actually be doing a stained glass installation for these doors. Again, one of those things that's waiting budget. A little bit cute, these images, but this was the inaugural mass, and it is, I think, again, I think consistent with the landscape thinking that this creates the potential for the programs, and in a sense, the structure is completed by the people occupying the structure itself, although we do hope to replace the plastic chairs with a chair and a bench that we have designed ourselves. So yeah, I mean, I think again, to close with this project and suggest, on the one hand, the necessity of working at these multiple scales, multiple different programs, the sort of pleasure of getting a small project like this built and sort of seeing it out there in the world, but also the suggestion that this building, as a kind of pavilion form that's much more sort of open and connected to the landscape, doesn't kind of set itself off through a kind of environmental separation. That attention to openness and zones of transition and articulating the connectivity of spaces that I think in some ways shows a certain continuing interest in the potentials of some intersection between architecture and landscape. So, thank you very much.
I've got a dumb question. The last project disproved my question. But before the last project, it seems that within all the kind of more master or landscape type projects, you very consciously try to avoid any notion of cliche or quotation with the work. But within architectural projects, that's not a bug of the feature.
Sure,
It's something
sure.
like as part of the repertoire of architectural techniques, and part of the repertoire of landscape.
Right.
So I was just wondering, why the scale and kind of narrative of the project makes that change.
It's an interesting question. I mean, I think maybe somebody more invested in landscape also might see a series of references and notations in landscape work as well. But I think, to me, you put your finger on I think one of the difficulties that we always wrestle with as architects, which seems to me the minute that you commit to that kind of iconic form of the figure, you're necessarily entering into a game of reference and entering into a kind of conversation with the rest of the discipline that it's true there. And I you know, maybe this is maybe this is my fifth crutch, right? Which is to say, the degree to which the rhetoric of landscape urbanism has often appealed to sort of function and infrastructure and engineering and so on, as if they could finesse the questions of style and form as a result. Now again, I don't think they're able to do that, and I think, you know, for example, I mean the whole fascination with graphics and patterning in landscape urbanism is very much entering already into a kind of formal discourse. But I think you're absolutely right. It's inescapable the minute you enter into the realm of architecture, and its sort of presence as a kind of figure on the landscape. Necessarily that's going to kick it in. Yeah.
You mentioned landscape urbanism moving into a void. Obviously, physical planning moved out of it.
Yeah.
So it left perhaps the master plan as one artifact that might be useful. Are there either other residues or any detritus that you'd like to clear out?
From the planning profession? Well, you know, again, I think that one of the primary arguments in landscape urbanism is precisely that you replace master planning with strategic planning, and that landscape urbanism's embrace of change and evolution, change over time and evolution, makes it particularly well suited to kind of work strategically. And you know, this notion of, I mean, the term seeding the site with potential that Jim Corner's picked up from Koolhaas, of course. I mean, good baggage or bad baggage? I mean, I think inevitably some of the. I mean, look, I just to some degree speak from experience that. The minute that you insert yourself into that institutional realm, and that as landscape urbanists take on large-scale planning projects, you necessarily take on a lot of that baggage, and you spend your life talking to bureaucrats in city planning departments. I don't think that's a bad thing. I mean, I think first of all, there are new generations of people in city planning departments that are actually bringing a lot of creativity to what they do. So I think that the sort of old notion that the bureaucrats are the bad guys is also turning over a little bit. But yeah, you do almost inevitably take on some of that baggage that a lot of your time is going to be spent dealing with budgets and statistics and which department finances this work. And I mean, look, the Type A project is running into difficulties primarily for that reason. The mayor loves the idea, and all of his planning and design staff love it, and the engineers in charge of the flood wall hate it. They're scared to death. I mean, they don't want an architect from the U.S. messing with their flood wall. So you do encounter all of those traditional institutional and bureaucratic hurdles. And again, I think that you can run from that and say, I just don't want to deal with this kind of work, or you can try and address them in a kind of creative way, and sort of hope optimistically that there's a sort of newer generation of people in those positions that are more open-oriented solutions, which is, I think, is beginning to happen both in Asia and Europe and here as well. Yeah.
So would you say that maybe a sixth crutch is as landscape urbanism is the term to kind of deny the sort of politics inherent in urban politics? The one thing that distinguishes, say, sort of projects like Taipei or crushed hills is that they seem to be very
Sure.
of the strategy.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you're absolutely correct. And I think that's, in a way, it's been one of the geniuses of landscape urbanism, is that nobody is against landscape. And it's like mom and apple pie, and especially now in the kind of climate of sustainability and so on. So, yeah, I mean, I guess maybe to put a slightly more positive spin on it, you could say that there's a kind of progressive design agenda that's kind of smuggled in within the Trojan horse of green in that case. But yeah, I mean, look, the mayor in Taipei came to us. I mean, he's a very charismatic guy. He's Western educated. He's also a brilliant politician. And he said, make it 1/3 green, 1/3 culture, and 1/3 commerce. And so, I mean, he was very pragmatic about the trade-off necessary, that he saw the creation of a new park and the production of cultural institutions as a benefit to the city. And if he had to trade what in the end was more like 40% of the land area to commercial development, he saw that as a kind of reasonable trade-off to make. So, but it is, I mean, that's pragmatic politics. It's not necessarily, politics in the sense of critical ideology. But yeah, I mean, I think you could criticize practitioners of landscape urbanism, I suppose myself included, that knowing that the carrot that you can hang out on any one of these projects is the provision of green space, and nobody in a city agency or a community review board or whatever is ever going to be against the green component, with the exception of the people who pay the bills and wonder who's going to pay for the maintenance of the place. Okay, to be continued, 3:30 tomorrow.